Silence is the one language a narcissist never learns to speak, because the moment you stop giving them your attention, your reactions, and your energy, you don't just walk away from them, you take back the power they secretly depended on to feel whole. And while you begin to heal in peace, they are left alone with the very emptiness they spent a lifetime trying to escape. When no contact begins, the very first thing a narcissist experiences is not heartbreak or longing, but psychological shock. Because the sudden disappearance of their emotional supply feels like the ground has shifted beneath their feet. And this reaction is deeper than most people understand, since narcissistic personalities rely heavily on external validation to regulate their sense of self. Meaning they do not generate stability from within, but borrow it from the people around them, especially those closest to them. So when you stop calling, stop replying, and stop reacting, you are not simply creating distance. You are cutting off the system they unconsciously depend on to feel important, admired, and in control. And without that steady stream of attention, their internal world becomes chaotic and disorganized. They wake up expecting the usual notifications, the predictable drama, the emotional exchanges that once reassured them of their power, and when none of that appears, their brain struggles to process what is happening, because in their mind, you were never meant to leave on your own terms. You were supposed to chase them, forgive them, or at least argue back, so your silence violates the script they had written for you, creating a kind of cognitive dissonance where reality does not match their expectations. And this mismatch produces anxiety, restlessness, and a compulsive need to check their phone or social media, almost like withdrawal symptoms, because in many ways, attention works like an addiction for them, giving quick hits of reassurance that they still matter. This is why they may suddenly act busy, overly social, or strangely energized, as if nothing bothers them, because shock often hides behind forced confidence. Yet internally, there is confusion and a subtle panic that they cannot easily name. A feeling that something valuable slipped away without their permission. And what makes this stage so destabilizing is that it removes their illusion of control. Since narcissists measure their worth by how much influence they have over others, and when someone calmly walks away without explanation or emotional reaction, it sends a message that they no longer have power, and for a person whose identity depends on dominance and validation, that loss registers like an emotional free fall that keeps them mentally scrambling for a way to restore balance and regain the certainty they once felt when you were still within reach, still responding, still available to be pulled back into their orbit, still present enough to reassure them that they were never truly alone or replaceable, and that they could always count on your reaction to steady their fragile sense of self, which now feels uncertain and exposed and difficult to stabilize without you being there to reflect them back to themselves in familiar ways that once kept their ego intact and their world predictable, and safe enough to avoid facing their own emptiness and dependence on external approval that they work so hard to deny, but cannot escape whenever silence takes away the one thing they thought they could always control and keep close enough to reassure themselves of their importance and permanence in someone else's life and mind. After the initial shock settles, the narcissist slips into denial, and this stage is far more calculated than it appears, because denial acts like a psychological shield that protects their fragile ego from facing the painful truth that someone has actually chosen to walk away, which directly threatens the grand image they carry of themselves as irresistible, superior, and impossible to abandon. So instead of admitting that your silence hurts or that your absence matters, they quickly rewrite the narrative in their mind to make it seem small, temporary, or meaningless, telling themselves that you are just emotional, dramatic, or trying to get attention, convincing themselves that you will be back any day now because in their worldview, people do not truly leave them. They simply orbit away for a moment and then return. And this belief allows them to avoid confronting the deeper fear that they might have lost control for good. They may even laugh about it with friends, act indifferent, or speak about you as though you never mattered. But this performance is not confidence. It is defense, because acknowledging your departure would force them to feel rejection. And rejection is something their psyche is not built to tolerate, so they numb it by pretending it does not exist, keeping busy, distracting themselves, jumping into conversations or activities that make them feel admired, anything that helps them avoid the quiet moments when reality tries to seep in. And yet beneath this surface bravado, there is constant mental checking, subtle monitoring, and silent anticipation, because denial does not erase awareness. It only postpones it. They still glance at their phone expecting your name to appear, still replay old patterns in their head assuming you will reach out like you always did, still leave emotional doors half open just in case you come back, because fully accepting the separation would mean admitting they were not as powerful or unforgettable as they believed, and that realization feels like a crack in the foundation of their identity. So denial becomes a story they keep telling themselves over and over, a carefully constructed illusion that buys them time and protects them from shame, even though deep down there is a growing discomfort they cannot fully silence, a quiet suspicion that your absence is different this time, that you are not playing a game, that you are not waiting for their permission, and that maybe for the first time, someone has stepped outside their reach and stayed there, which creates an unsettling tension between what they pretend to believe and what they secretly fear, leaving them stuck in a state where they must constantly reinforce the lie of indifference just to avoid collapsing into the vulnerable truth that they were left and that they may not be able to pull you back the way they always assumed they could. As denial begins to crumble and reality becomes harder to ignore, the narcissist often shifts into anger, and this stage is intense, reactive, and sometimes frightening because anger feels far safer to them than vulnerability, since admitting hurt would mean admitting weakness, and weakness threatens the grand image they have built around themselves. So instead of saying, "I miss them," or "I feel abandoned," their mind automatically converts that pain into blame, accusation, and rage, allowing them to protect their ego by projecting responsibility outward, which means you become the villain in their story simply because you chose to walk away. And this distorted thinking helps them avoid looking inward or taking accountability for their behavior. So they tell themselves that you were ungrateful, unstable, disloyal, or selfish, rewriting history in ways that make them look justified and make you look cruel. And this mental reframing gives them temporary relief because it restores a sense of superiority. But underneath it, there is still the sting of rejection that they cannot fully escape. You might notice that during this stage they start talking badly about you to mutual friends, spreading rumors, exaggerating your flaws, or sharing private details out of context. Not because they truly believe those things, but because damaging your reputation helps them regain a feeling of control, as if pulling you down somehow lifts them back up. And sometimes this anger turns into impulsive behaviors like sending harsh messages, blocking and unblocking you, posting things online meant to provoke jealousy, or rushing into dramatic displays of independence, all of which are attempts to prove that they are unaffected. Yet the very intensity of these reactions reveals the opposite, because indifference does not need theatrics, and calm people do not wage emotional wars. Anger in this context is really panic disguised as power. A frantic effort to push away the uncomfortable truth that your absence matters more than they want to admit. And what fuels this rage even further is the loss of control, because narcissists often equate love with possession. So when you step outside their influence without asking or negotiating, it feels like defiance. Like you broke an unspoken rule that said they get to decide when things end. And that perceived loss of dominance can trigger deep frustration, making them feel exposed and powerless in ways they are not emotionally equipped to handle. So rather than sit with that discomfort, they lash out mentally or socially, creating noise and chaos to drown out the quiet realization that someone they assumed would always stay has finally stopped responding, stopped reacting, and stopped participating in their emotional game, leaving them alone with feelings they cannot regulate and a bruised ego that keeps searching for someone to blame, instead of facing the painful possibility that their own behavior pushed you away, and that no amount of anger can force you back or undo the emptiness they now feel without your presence reflecting their importance back to them. After the anger burns through and their attempts to blame you stop giving them relief, the narcissist often slips into a quieter but far more consuming stage, obsession. And this is where something unexpected happens, because the very person they acted indifferent toward becomes the center of their mental world. Not out of love or genuine care, but out of wounded pride and unresolved control. Since your continued silence creates a psychological itch they cannot scratch, a question they cannot answer, and for someone who is used to managing every emotional dynamic, not knowing what you are doing or thinking feels unbearable, so they begin monitoring you in subtle and not so subtle ways, checking your social media repeatedly, scrolling through old photos, rereading past messages, asking mutual friends casual questions that are not casual at all, pretending curiosity while secretly searching for evidence that you still think about them, because what they truly want is confirmation that they still matter. And when they cannot get that confirmation directly, their mind fills the gaps with speculation, imagining who you might be talking to. Whether you are happier, whether you have replaced them, and each possibility triggers a fresh wave of anxiety that keeps them mentally hooked. This stage can look strange from the outside because they may still claim not to care, while spending an unreasonable amount of time thinking about you. And that contradiction exists because obsession is driven by ego injury rather than attachment, as they are not longing for connection, but for restored control, wanting to feel that they could pull you back if they chose to. So the fact that you remain unreachable makes you feel larger in their mind than you ever did when you were present, because scarcity increases perceived value, and the less access they have to you, the more their thoughts circle around you, replaying conversations, dissecting arguments, wondering what they could have said differently to keep you engaged, even if they would never admit that regret out loud. And this constant mental replay can create restlessness and irritability, as though something unfinished is hanging over them, because narcissistic personalities struggle deeply with unresolved endings, needing closure that favors them, needing the last word, needing to feel like they decided how things ended, and your no contact denies them all of that, leaving them stuck in a loop where they keep mentally reaching for someone who is no longer responding, which makes you paradoxically more powerful in absence than you ever were in presence, turning you into an unsolved problem they cannot stop trying to figure out, and a silent reminder that for once, they are not the one in control of the narrative or the outcome or the emotional connection that once felt guaranteed and easily accessible whenever they wanted attention or reassurance, or proof that they still had influence over someone who is now completely beyond their reach and their ability to manipulate or predict. When obsession fails to bring relief and they realize that watching from a distance does not restore their sense of control, the narcissist often moves into bargaining. And this stage can be confusing because it may look like remorse, accountability, or sudden emotional growth. But beneath the surface, it is usually a strategic attempt to reopen access rather than a sincere desire to repair the relationship. Since what they truly miss is not the connection itself, but the benefits they received from it, the attention, the admiration, the reassurance, the feeling of power that came from knowing they could reach you whenever they wanted. So when those privileges disappear, their mind begins calculating ways to pull you back in, almost like a negotiation where they offer just enough kindness or vulnerability to make you reconsider your boundaries. And this is when you might receive unexpected messages, apologies that sound rehearsed, sentimental memories, late-night texts saying they have been thinking about you, or promises that they have changed. And while these gestures can feel emotional and persuasive, They are often timed around their own discomfort, appearing when they feel lonely, rejected by someone else, or bored, which reveals that the motivation is self-soothing rather than genuine empathy. During this stage, they may say things they never said before, admitting fault in small doses, complimenting you, acting softer or more attentive, because they understand on some level that the old tactics of anger or blame no longer work, so they switch to charm and vulnerability as tools, almost like trying different keys to see which one unlocks the door. And the moment you respond, even with frustration or curiosity, they feel a surge of relief because contact equals supply, attention equals control, and your reaction reassures them that they still matter in your world, which is why the communication often fades again once they feel secure, since the goal was not lasting change but restored access. Bargaining is essentially an emotional transaction where they attempt to trade temporary niceness for renewed influence. And the tragedy is that many people mistake this for love or regret, hoping that the apologies mean growth. When in reality, true change requires deep self-reflection and consistent behavior over time. Something narcissistic patterns rarely sustain, so the cycle repeats, with them offering just enough hope to keep you engaged while never fully committing to accountability, because doing so would mean facing their own flaws without defenses, and that level of vulnerability feels far more threatening to them than losing the relationship, leaving them stuck in this manipulative middle ground where every word is carefully shaped to pull you closer, not to meet you halfway, but to guide you back into a position where they can once again feel secure, validated, and in control of the emotional dynamic that your silence had taken away from them, and that they are desperately trying to reclaim through persuasion rather than true transformation or responsibility. When bargaining no longer works, and every message, apology, or attempt to charm you back is met with silence, the narcissist slowly approaches a stage that feels heavier and far more destabilizing than anything before it. An internal collapse of the ego, where the usual defenses stop protecting them and they are forced, even if only briefly, to confront the reality that they have truly lost access to you. And this is not the cinematic regret of romance or heartfelt reflection, but a raw, uncomfortable recognition that someone they assumed would always remain within reach has permanently stepped outside their control, which cuts directly into the core of how they define their worth. Because narcissistic personalities build their identity on dominance, admiration, and influence. So when those external confirmations disappear, there is very little inside to hold them steady, leaving them with an unfamiliar emptiness that feels confusing and frightening. Without you responding, arguing, or chasing, there is nothing to bounce their ego off of, nothing to reassure them that they still matter. And that silence becomes a mirror, showing them a version of themselves they work hard to avoid, a version that feels small, replaceable, and powerless. And this realization can lead to moments of quiet regret where they replay the relationship and begin noticing things they dismissed before, remembering how much you tolerated, how much you gave, how often you stayed when others would have left. And for a fleeting second, they may recognize that losing you was not entirely your fault, but partly the result of their own behavior. Yet even this insight is uncomfortable because accepting responsibility threatens their entire self-image, so the regret often mixes with shame and defensiveness, creating mood swings, irritability, or sudden withdrawal as they struggle to process emotions they were never taught to handle. They might feel restless, distracted, or strangely low in energy because the constant chase for validation has hit a wall. And without new supply, the internal void becomes louder, making everyday life feel flatter and less satisfying. And although they may never admit it publicly, there is a private awareness that you represented stability and loyalty they took for granted. And now that you are gone, the absence feels permanent, like a door that will not reopen no matter how hard they knock, which leaves them facing the uncomfortable truth that their charm and control are not as absolute as they believed, that someone saw through the cycle and chose themselves instead, and that realization quietly undermines the grand story they tell about being unforgettable and irreplaceable, forcing them to sit with a fragile sense of self that no longer feels protected by your presence, and that they do not quite know how to rebuild on their own without reaching for another person to fill the space you once occupied and the certainty you once provided that they mattered and were needed and could always depend on your reaction to stabilize their shaken identity and soothe the insecurity they try so hard to deny. In the end, what you must understand is that no contact was never about punishing them or making them suffer. It was about saving yourself, reclaiming your sanity, and stepping out of a cycle that slowly drained your confidence and peace. Because when you finally stop explaining, stop chasing closure, and stop offering your energy to someone who only used it to feed their ego, something powerful happens. The entire dynamic flips, and while they move through shock, denial, anger, obsession, bargaining, and finally that quiet ego collapse, you move in the opposite direction toward clarity, strength, and emotional freedom. And that is the part most people overlook, because this journey is not really about what the narcissist feels. It is about what you regain: your sleep, your focus, your self-respect, your ability to breathe without walking on eggshells. And yes, they may experience regret. They may think about you late at night. They may stalk your social media. They may even try to come back with softer words and promises. But their regret is rooted in lost control, not transformed character, and confusing those two things can pull you right back into the same trap you fought so hard to escape. So the real victory is not seeing them miss you. It is reaching a place where their feelings no longer control your choices, where their texts no longer shake you, where their absence feels like relief instead of loss. Because that is when you know you have truly detached, and the irony is almost poetic. The very silence they thought meant nothing becomes the one thing they cannot handle, while the very silence you feared becomes your greatest source of power, teaching you that closure does not come from their apology, but from your boundary, not from their understanding, but from your decision to walk away and stay away. And when you hold that line with calm confidence, without drama or revenge, you send the strongest message possible, that your life no longer revolves around their approval, and that quiet strength is something they may never comprehend, but will always, in some unspoken corner of their mind, regret losing forever.